This is the second part, second 25 minutes or so of March 23rd lecture for class. So in the second part, we're going to finish up talking about estuaries. And that should take us through most of this lecture. And then we'll be done with March 23rd. March 25th, you were supposed to have an exam. So what we're going to do is take that day off, and you can have that time to catch up. We've got lectures that were posted on Sakai for the week of March 16th. Of course, we didn't have class then, so you weren't expected to do that work during that week. But we're going to look at this as like having 3 snow days that we're going to catch up. As I mentioned, I don't want to shortchange you, and I want to take the opportunity to give you all the information that you would have gotten normally. Now, towards the end of the semester, we may find that we've gotten through everything, and we may even finish a day early, but rather finish early than to run out of time at the end. So, productivity in estuaries. That's the topic that we're on now. And people have known about this for a long time. We've been taking advantage of estuaries for a long time, whether you're George Washington or Native Americans or wherever people were around estuaries, they were taking advantage of the high level of productivity for thousands of years. So in terms of nutrients, what do organisms need? By now, hopefully, you're somewhat familiar with the need for nitrogen. Nitrogen is in every ATP, every RNA, every DNA, every amino acid, every protein. Nitrogen, very, very important. Silica, we saw, was part of the cell wall or part of the shell of different organisms. It's an important nutrient. Phosphate, or phosphorus, in the form of phosphate, is also very important. And in every DNA, every RNA, every ATP. And then there's carbon as well as a few other things. So there's a lot of nutrients that are being delivered by this constant supply of fresh water moving into estuaries. A lot of nutrients. And as I said before, it's shallow. That means there's a lot of light. Light and nutrients, photosynthesis, great place for primary productivity. We'll see a little later when we look at the communities that are associated with estuaries that a lot of the primary production is accomplished by plants. There's some phytoplankton, certainly. There's some algae, and those are easily consumed. There's a lot of things that eat them, but there's a lot of plants around the periphery of estuaries especially, and they're not eaten so easily. So just like when we looked at seagrasses, salt marsh grasses, and we looked at mangroves, all 3 of those flowering plants that are common in the ocean enter food webs, mostly in the form of detritus. They die, they sink to the bottom, and then they're decomposed, and bacteria use them, and they enter into food chains, food webs, as detritus. There's a lot of detritivores that utilize this, so it may not be something that's directly consumed by organisms, but either way, even as detritus, there it is again in bold red letters. There's a lot of energy. There's a lot of organic matter that enters into estuaries, into this ecosystem, but it's in this form of detritus. So if you compare estuaries with the open ocean, for instance, estuaries, 100 times the amount of organic matter that you find out in the open ocean. Organic matter contains energy, for one, contains carbon, nitrogen, phosphate, those nutrients. One of the accessory ecosystems or communities that we're going to look at, you find in and around estuaries, is mudflats. If you look at mudflats, it doesn't seem like it's really that productive of an area if you think about it, but can support 10 times more biomass than sediments when you move offshore, out on the continental shelf that we'll look at later. And both the sediments themselves and the organisms that are there, plants and some animals as well, are very good at extracting these nutrients from the sediments and altering these sediments, storing these nutrients in the sediments, and deriving energy and nutrients from the sediments. So either way you look at it, it is a very productive area. So you've got all this primary production. You've got all this detritus that eventually makes its way to marine mammals and birds and fish. There are a lot of invertebrates, and there's a lot of vertebrates, especially fish, that utilize estuaries as nursery areas. Whether it's their young, whether it's they move in there to reproduce, to lay their eggs like striped bass and bluefish do, or whether they spend a lot more time there, like a lot of different species. Why are these estuaries such a good place? If you're a small organism, small fish, or an invertebrate, and you're vulnerable to predation. Well, one, it's a physically separate space from the rest of the ocean. So there's fewer predators there. In terms of surviving, it's a good place to be because there's fewer things that can eat you. In terms of food, I just got done talking about how productive it was. There's a lot of energy. So if it's a safe place and it's a very energetic place, it's no wonder that so many organisms use estuaries as nursery areas, at least part of their life, some of them for a long, long time. So you've got a lot of shellfish, you've got a lot of fish, bony fish. Around here, I'm sure some of you are familiar with, you go out fishing in the summertime off of Rhode Island or Massachusetts or New Jersey, wherever you're from. Bluefish, very popular sport fish. People don't eat them so much. You can, but they're very popular fish. And another fish that people are really after is striped bass. Both of those use estuaries quite heavily. And if you throw in flounder and fluke, those are also heavily targeted species around here. So whether they utilize this as young or whether they're like bluefish or striped bass that move into these estuaries to lay their eggs, and there's part of their life cycle is in the estuaries until they move out in the open ocean. Heavy use of estuaries by a lot of different types of fish. Well, if you live in the estuary, as I mentioned before, it's very productive. It's a good place to avoid predation. However, it's really quite challenging to live there. One of the main reasons why it's challenging, and one of the main reasons why a lot of organisms can't live in estuaries very well, is because of the salinity. This salinity can change drastically from the surface to the bottom. As you saw, it could be 5 parts per thousand at the surface and 25 parts per thousand salinity at the bottom, just 50 feet away. It is there's a very large gradient from where the river is versus where the ocean is in terms of salinity. Can multiply, that's 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 parts per thousand in a relatively short period of time. And not only that, but we saw these tidal changes earlier in the semester where the tide comes in, the tide goes out. Those tidal fluxes take place within a 6-hour time span. So even if you didn't move at all, even if you're completely stuck on the bottom, you could be experiencing salinities of 10 parts per thousand, 6 hours later, 30 parts per thousand, 6 hours later, back to 10. Now, those salinity changes are not easy to deal with, and the organisms that are found in the estuaries can deal with those, as we'll see. But if you can't tolerate salinity changes very quickly, then you're not going to be found in an estuary. Or if you stumble into an estuary, you're not going to survive there, or you're not going to last there. You're going to move. Another thing, there's a river flowing into these estuaries. That's strong water movement. And some of these, the ocean, when the tide comes up, the ocean is like a river flowing into the estuary. It's like a river flowing in the opposite direction. very strong currents. So you've got to be able to deal with those currents one way or the other, whether you're on the bottom or whether you're in the water column. And then another thing, especially for organisms around the periphery, are temperature changes that are more extreme in estuaries for some organisms than out in the rest of the ocean. So let's look at these three different challenges. Salinity. Salinity can change very quickly. Salinity, you have to do something with the changing salinity. You either have to tolerate it, like most invertebrates do, or you have to regulate it, like most vertebrates do. So what we're going to do this whole time is compare the salinity, basically, or the concentration of solutes in the body fluid of an organism, so their blood, their tissues, their intercellular fluid. What's the concentration of solutes? Sodium, chloride, magnesium, calcium, all those different ions, and what is that concentration compared to the water that they occupy? If you look at invertebrates, most invertebrates are osmoconformers. Both of these, invertebrates and vertebrates, will tolerate a wide range of salinities. That means they're euryhaline. They can tolerate a wide range of salinities. Stenohaline means that you can't tolerate a wide range, that you're well adapted to a narrow range of salinities. Most organisms out in the open ocean are stenohaline. They don't need to tolerate salinity changes because they don't experience them. Same with freshwater organisms. They don't experience these salinity changes. So this rapidly changing salinity environment in estuaries, this change in salinities that occurs over a short distance in estuaries, it results in the organisms you find there commonly being euryhaline. So invertebrates are osmoconformers. As the salinity of the water changes, the composition of their body fluids changes. As the salinity increases, the concentration of solutes in their body fluid increases. As it decreases, the concentration of solutes in their body decreases. They conform with the salinity of the water that they're found in. That's a very common, that's the standard way of life for invertebrates. Vertebrates, on the other hand, fish, reptiles, birds, mammals, they're strict osmoregulators. Their body fluids, their blood, their tissues are maintained at a narrow range of concentrations. Their concentration of solutes in their body and their blood and the fluid in between their cells doesn't fluctuate wildly. They maintain homeostasis. It's very expensive to do that energetically. They expend a lot of energy to do that. In fact, this osmoregulation, especially for estuarine organisms, takes up more energy than anything else. So they are osmoregulators, strict osmoregulators. There are some that are somewhat in between. So let's look at a figure that illustrates this. Here's a figure that shows on the y-axis is osmolarity, or in other words, that's the concentration of solutes in the blood, in the body fluid, in the tissues of an organism. On the x-axis is the salinity of the water. So 5, that's almost fresh water. 35 is full-strength seawater. So if you look, let's look at osmoregulators first, because that's easy to see. There's a fish there. They expend a lot of energy. They drink all the time, and they excrete salts. They maintain a constant concentration of solutes in their body. Strict osmoregulators. If you look at invertebrates, like that crab and that jellyfish is a osmoconformer over a shorter distance, a shorter span of seawater concentrations, salt concentrations, salinities. So let's look at that crab. The crab, maybe there's a little bit, from 5 to 10 parts per thousand where that crab osmoregulates. It can expend that much energy. It can do that. But over the wide range of salinities you might experience in an estuary, like 5 to 25 or 30, see what happens in that gold dashed line, that when the water that crab is becomes more saline, higher salinity, then the body fluids of that crab become more concentrated with salts or solutes. At a low salinity, the body composition of that crab has a low concentration of solutes. At a higher salinity, as you go up, the body fluids of that crab or other invertebrates increases with the same way that the salinity increases. Well, as I mentioned before, you've got a river. Sometimes it's a big giant river that's flowing into this estuary, like the Hudson River, or it could be the Delaware River. Big rivers flowing into these estuaries. So there's water that's moving. Some places, some of these estuaries, there's a big tidal flux, a strong tidal current that moves into the estuary or moves out. So what do you do if you live in a place where there's a lot of water movement? Later, we'll look at waves crashing and how organisms deal with that, and some of these ecosystems that we're going to look at, there's not very much water movement. They're pretty stagnant, and organisms are adapted to that kind of lifestyle. Well, let's say you live on the bottom. There's not much to attach to. There's not many rocks, not much hard substrate. It's a lot of soft substrate. This is a very productive place. There's a lot of dead, decaying organic matter, a lot of sediments. Not much to attach yourself to. So there's a lot of burrowing that takes place. There's rhizomes where there's an extensive root system that helps you anchor in soft sediment, but you don't have hard sediment to attach to, hard substrate to attach to, like in some other ecosystems. In the continental shelf, rocky shore, you have to deal with sediment. A lot of burrowing organisms. Another option is that you're in the water column and you're not on the bottom, but you're swimming around. Then you've either got to, if it's efficient, if you go with the flow, when the water is moving down, you move down. When it's moving in, you move in. But a lot of organisms swim against the current, somewhat anyway, and maintain their position at a certain level within the estuary, certain distance, or they swim up, and so it decreases the amount of distance that they travel by swimming upstream. They're still being swept out towards the sea when the tide's going out, and they're being swept up farther into the estuary when the tide's coming in, but it reduces the amount of distance that they cover. Well, another thing that you might not realize is that there's temperature extremes that organisms in estuaries are faced with. Let's say there's the snow melt and there's a bunch of cold water that comes into the estuary. That can change the water temperature pretty quickly. There's a big storm. It also changes the salinity quickly as well. See, there's seasonal changes in salinity. There's rainy seasons with a lot of fresh water. I forgot to mention that with the salinity changes. But it also influences temperature. So that's one thing, is how quickly the temperature can change in an estuary. The second thing is that as we look at these ecosystems or communities that are associated with estuaries, we'll see that a lot of them are around the periphery, and sometimes they're exposed at low tide. If you're out of the water, then the temperature fluctuates much greater than if you're underwater. And so compared to something that's out in the open ocean or out in deep water or even submerged all the time, temperature doesn't change very much for those organisms. But if you're exposed and you're in the water, you're out of the water, especially when you're out of the water, then you can experience big temperature fluctuations, and not to mention desiccation. So being able to tolerate at least a fairly broad range of temperatures fairly quickly sometimes is another characteristic you find in a number of estuarine organisms. They've got to be able to deal with this temperature change. All right, I think that is good for now for this first day, this March 23rd, because we've got a couple of other things to look at in terms of these estuaries. That and then eventually we'll talk about the communities that are associated with estuaries. So this would be a good place to stop for this first day. Now, if you haven't looked at those lectures that were posted for last week, they're posted in those folders, not because last week you were supposed to go and be watching those, but as a placeholder for you to locate them, and we're making up this time that we missed gradually. So you can go back and start viewing those video lectures that are posted in March 16th, whether you did those last week or not. We're making up for what we missed, and we're starting the course in earnest right now for the rest of the semester.